Okay, great. So let me go to the first slide. Good morning, everybody. Today's webinar is on how to share the investment costs of energy infrastructure projects between countries. And my first slide is to give a bit of background on why we are asking this question today. You should know that we are in front of a new wave of investments. We are really going to take the next step in the development of a trans-European network for electricity. This is always referred to as 10E. We had a 10E program for a while, but recently we had a new package that gives new life to this 10E policy. And what is the idea? Well, this idea is very nicely illustrated by DG Energy's recent communication, and it shows what will happen if we really do these investments that we have identified as of strategic importance for Europe. If we look at the European map today, you see countries here having a red color. Now, red, as you can see on the right here, is indicating that these countries are not able to import more than 10% of their local production capacity. Now, is that a problem? Not necessarily, but the idea is to create a European market. And if we want a European market, we want producers to compete on the European level rather than the national level. So that's why it is a political objective to go beyond this 10% threshold. Another reason that we would like to have more interconnection capacity is to make better use of the renewable energy sources that we are increasingly relying on. And of course, the third element is security of supply. Now, this is the current situation. If we would really do these investments that we have recently prioritized, in fact, we have had the publication of the first list of projects of common interest in January. And if we would do all the investments on that list, about 100, then we would go to a picture that looks much less red. So it would be indeed a big improvement from this point of view. Let me tell you a bit more about the treatment of projects of common interest. Well, the 10E regulation that was recently adopted foresees that we will have a more advanced regulatory treatment of these projects. Well, first, to become a project of common interest, these projects will have to present a cost-benefit analysis. So identifying all the benefits of investing in that project and, of course, also the costs. We used to do that. Every country had its own rules. But now, for the first time, we will have a European method, a common method used by all projects so that we can compare better projects and prioritize them at European level. In fact, that's how we started working on this topic. And here you can see the policy brief we published in the context of the Think project. And then, as we had started working on the topic, we said, let's also discuss the second important regulatory topic, which was, once we know the costs and the benefits of the projects, how to decide who is going to pay for them. And that's exactly the topic of today. For your information, we will continue to work on this topic. Actually, this policy brief was already published in February, and I've had the opportunity to discuss it for more than a year with regulators, with companies, with European Commission. So what I'm presenting today is the result of a one-year process I did together with my colleague Xian. Today I'm working with Nico on the third topic in the context of this 10E regulation, and this is TSO incentives. So I'm already looking forward to do a webinar later this year on that topic. Okay, let's go back to the topic of today. And there is no better way to start than to ask for your opinion. So I'd like to start with a poll, and I'll just going to ask you the title of my webinar, how to share the investment costs of PCI. So I already narrowed it down, and we're not talking anymore about energy infrastructure projects in general, but about PCIs and about electricity. And then I give you three options. The first option is that maybe you think that it's very easy. These projects are cross-border, but we can identify which part is on which country's territory, and we think, or you think, that each country should simply pay for the assets on its own territory. If you think that, take option A. Maybe some of you think, no, we will do a CBA analysis, so we will know who will benefit, and then we can implement the beneficiaries' pay principle, meaning that you would allocate the costs proportionally to the benefits. And then maybe you think, no, this is all too difficult. Let's simply do a burden sharing agreement. We have this list of 100 projects. Let's agree for all of them, more or less, how we will share the costs. And that could then be implemented with a kind of EU tariff component. Okay, so now I will launch this poll, and I'm very curious to know what you will answer. So 90% of you answered. I think that's great. So let's close the poll, and I will share the results with you. So as you can see, 11% of you believes option A is the best way forward, 51% thinks B, and 38% would like to do option C. Let's debrief about that. It's very interesting. Well, first, the 38% people that think that option C is the best, to my feeling, these are people that would like to have a second energy infrastructure package. Because my feeling is that the first energy infrastructure package does not yet have this ambition. So even if I maybe sympathize with this argument, I don't think it is feasible today. But as you might know, in the first package, there is already the provision to evaluate the impact of the first package. So if none of it, what we are doing today is working, we might have a second package that introduces this concept that 38% of you thinks is needed. So let's just, for those people, I don't want to disappoint you today, but let's think we are in the context of the first package where we are not yet this ambitious. So stay with me, and I will, to explain you the other views. Here you have a picture of the rock band Status Quo. You have also a picture of academics and a picture of our policy brief. And I will now explain you why I have these pictures here. Well, status quo means current practice. And basically the people that said option A is the best way forward, so indeed some of you, think that the current practice whereby each country pays for the assets on its own territory is fine, and we should simply continue with that. The most of you thought B, so most of you think we should apply this beneficiaries pay principle, and indeed it has really good theoretical properties, but as we argue in our policy brief, it's not so easy to implement in practice. And why is that? Well, if you want to allocate the costs proportionally to benefits, then you have the problem that there is a lot of uncertainty. So when we do cost-benefit analysis, we typically do that for several scenarios, and we know who are the beneficiaries in the different scenarios. But then you could have a long discussion on how to correct for this uncertainty, and this might be quite difficult in practice to do. So if you would like to have a magic formula, we could discuss endless about that formula. That's why what we argue in the policy brief, and I will elaborate on that in this webinar, is that the way forward could be something between A and B. And we could go to a case-by-case approach, and it means that in some cases, we could continue the current practice. If it works, why not simply continue it? But in some cases, and I will give you 2 examples in the webinar, it's clear, and countries are already doing that there is an interest to come up with an innovative cross-border cost allocation agreement. Let me then immediately give you one of these examples. So what you see here is an interconnector between Italy and Greece. It already exists, but if we go back in time to the discussions that were going on, the idea was that this interconnector was mainly going to benefit Italy and a bit less Greece, because Greece would be in a typical transit situation between Eastern Europe and Italy. So this is a case that applies to many other cases on the continent in Europe. And let me tell you how they solved this issue. So you could say that this project was more important and Italy wanted to push it ahead, while for Greece maybe they had other projects that were more had more benefits for them. So they ended up with a negotiation that resulted in Italy paying 75% of the project and Greece only 25%. Of course, besides that, there were also EU subsidies involved. But what is interesting is that both countries felt voluntarily they had an interest in deviating from the current practice, which would have been, in this case, a 50-50 split of the costs. And it was a success because the project exists and the countries were able to move forward. So that's what I mean with compensation. Compensation in this context is a deviation from the current practice. So Italy agreed to pay more for this project because it was a higher beneficiary. But it does not strictly apply the beneficiaries pay principle because it was, on average, 75 was not necessarily coming out of a magic formula. The countries also didn't know exactly the benefits for both, but there had been some CBA analysis and then some negotiation led to an agreement. But there is more to it. And that is very nicely illustrated by the case between Norway and Sweden. What that case shows is that we should not only discuss whether or not there could be a compensation from one country to the other, whether or not there could be a deviation from current practice. What Norway-Sweden tells us is that there is additional things we can do when coming up with an innovative cross-border cost allocation agreement. But let me first introduce you the case. Now, the facts are that Norway is a country that has a system that relies strongly on hydro. So in dry years, they can come close to shortages. And around 2005, this indeed started in Norway to appear, this situation, also because demand had been growing very fast. And especially in mid-Norway, because Norway is divided in 5 bidding zones, and especially in mid-Norway, there was an issue with potential shortages. So the best solution was, of course, one of the solutions was to increase the interconnection capacity between the bidding zones within Norway. That could have solved the situation. But it turned out that mid-Norway was easier and quicker to connect mid-Norway with Sweden, so this line A. In other words, this cross-border connection was very important for Norway. If you look at it from the Swedish point of view, this line was already discussed between Norway and Sweden at that time. It was already part of a Nordic grid plan, but it was not so urgent for Sweden. So it was planned to come at some point in time, but Norway wanted to speed it up. But Sweden was supposed to pay 75% of that project if you would apply the current practice. Each pays for the assets on its territory because by accident most of this line lies on Swedish territory. So strong benefits for Norway to speed up, not necessarily for Sweden, because for Sweden this line was interesting to trade and the trade value was going to be higher once this line B is ready. And until line B is ready, in fact, this line could not be fully utilized. So they sat down and they came to an agreement whereby Norway compensates Sweden for speeding up this line until line B is ready. So the interesting element we have in this case, and we didn't have in the previous case, that you have 2 very strongly complementary projects and you have an agreement between 2 countries that includes these 2 lines in one agreement. What is also very innovative in this case is that the agreement was not simply a gentleman's agreement, it led to a formal contract between the TSOs, between the project promoters. And as far as I know, this is the first time this happened, because in most other cases in Europe, when we have a cross-border project, there is no real formal contract between the 2 countries. What that means is if one of the 2 countries does not stick to the commitment, that has no consequences for that country, while it might have big consequences for the other country. So in fact, in the current practice, looks easy, but you could say that there is no real agreement because there is no contract and there is no consequences for one of the 2 not sticking to the agreement. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that case. And if we now generalize that And that's indeed what we did in our policy brief. And what we also wanted to do is to give guidance. And there are three involved parties here. You have the project promoters, you have national regulatory authorities, and you have Acer. So what we learned from these two cases is that it's really up to project promoters and national regulatory authorities to take the lead in designing innovative agreements, both in the case of Greece and Italy, and Norway and Sweden. It was indeed the promoters together with the NRAs that designed an agreement, and the agreement is very different in the two cases. So you could say that we are at the beginning of experimenting with new type of contracts, with new type of agreements. So it's very hard to standardize this already today at European level. What we should do rather is to encourage this type of innovation. That's why we also say to Acer, because as you might know, if NRAs, so the whole process of cross-border cost allocation is that project promoters, when the project is mature, go to NRAs. NRAs then have to decide if they agree or not. And if they cannot agree among countries how to split the costs, within 6 months, the decision goes to Acer. That's why we also had to give guidance to Acer what to do in that case. And our guidance has been to limit the intervention to guaranteeing a kind of minimum standard. And to, of course, to promote good practices like the two we have identified. And why is that? Well, exactly because of what I said. Because today it is hard to already standardize these agreements. So better to have a minimum intervention by Acer and to encourage promoters and NRAs to come up with innovative agreements. What do we actually mean with that? Well, there is 3 dimensions to an innovative agreement. One is to base it on the cost-benefit analysis, which we will have anyway, because all these projects of common interest have gone through a CBA method. So we can use it. It doesn't mean we have to strictly apply beneficiaries pay principle, but we can use it as part of a negotiation and as part of an agreement that is in the benefit of both countries, not only the country that is compensating the other. Then what we said is that it's good to have an agreement, but it's better to have a contract. So maybe it's time to consider entering into a formal contract in more projects. Of course, this contract should include force majeure, because it's not necessarily the fault of one country, that of one promoter, for instance, or one NRA, that a project is delayed. But we can at least foresee in that contract what is under the control and not under the control from the parties involved in the project. And the last one, which we saw in the case of Norway and Sweden, is that it is a good practice to agree on a set of projects, especially if they are strongly complementary, rather than looking only at individual projects. And what did we have in mind with this minimum standard for Acer? Well, again, you have the same 3 dimensions. First, we say it could be good that Acer takes away, if a case would come to them, the strongest disincentive that could be applying to a certain country, which is that if you have a country with a very strong likelihood, so across all scenarios, to be a significant loser of a project, it could be good that Acer in its decision already compensates that loss, or makes the other countries that do benefit compensate that loss. Regarding contract, it could be good that already Acer safeguards the risk of stranded costs, so that there is a contract that is contingent to the commissioning date. For instance, if Acer would decide one country has to compensate the other, that compensation could then be contingent to the commissioning date, so that if in the case of Sweden, Norway, Sweden is sticking to its agreement to speed up but doesn't reach the agreed commissioning date, that the compensation is reduced. The last is this project grouping. Here, what is important is actually the CBA method, because if you will read our policy brief on the CBA method, already there we were arguing that when you define a project of common interest, it is very important that complementary projects or complementary investments are considered as one project. And if they are defined as one project, automatically they will also have one cross-border cost allocation agreement. Okay, that is it. But before we enter into the Q&A, I would like to know if everything I said changed your mind. So I will give you again the opportunity to repeat if you still believe current practice should continue in all cases. If you still believe that we should come up with a formula for applying strictly in all cases the beneficiaries pay principle, you can answer B. But now I also give you the option to agree with what we said in that policy brief, which is basically that we think there should be a case-by-case approach, so a kind of in between A and B. Okay, so I'm going to launch this second poll, and I'm very curious about what you will say. Here we go. Okay. Great. I will close the poll and I will share the results. So I'm very happy to see that at least I convinced some of you. So it's very nice. 85% believe in that this case-by-case approach has some potential. And I, of course, accept that 3% disagrees and that we should continue current practice, which I agree could be the case for most projects. In fact, I am not sure to what extent this case-by-case practice will lead to innovative agreements. It could be that we will have a few cases like Greece, Italy, Norway, Sweden, but the future will tell how many of these cases will emerge and how many of the cases will still simply continue with current practice. And then, of course, I like also the optimists that think 12% of you that are convinced that we can strictly apply this beneficiary pay principle. So that's all from me, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
So now we go to the Q&A session. We received many questions. I can start with this question. Which are the best quantitative indicators that can be used to assess the benefits of an interconnection line in each country?
Well, that brings us basically to the policy brief we published before on the CBA method. No? So I won't elaborate too much because we did a webinar on that in the past, and the person asking the question, I would invite to have a look at on YouTube, at the YouTube channel of Florence School of Regulation, where you can find webinars we did in the past, and so including that webinar. But basically what we said there is that what is most important is to go to a monetization. So because that is the big discussion point on that topic. Should we have a multi-criteria analysis and then which criteria to include, or should we go for a monetization approach? And the main argument I put forward in that other policy brief was that it's very important to go to a monetization.
Okay, thank you for this answer. Now let's go to the next question. The proposed solutions focus on the countries hosting the assets on their territory. In your view, should CBCA be extended to other countries who are significantly affected but who are not hosting any asset?
It depends. As I said, I think it's important to give countries the leading role in coming up with innovative cross-border cost allocation agreements. So, I mean, because they should do it out of their own interest. And if that third country that these other countries would like to pay part of the cost also has an interest in that project because that third country is a strong beneficiary, you could indeed imagine cases where that country voluntarily wants to contribute to the project because that project is so important for that country, even if it is not on its own territory, that country, like in the case of Norway, is really facing a shortage or a problem, and it sees that other project as the best solution for that problem. And in that case, you would imagine three parties sitting around the table and agreeing voluntarily. but then in return expecting something, a commitment, which could be formalized in a contract.
Yeah, so basically we come back to the case-by-case solution. Yeah.
Yes.
Then let's go to the third question. How could we implement option C from the first poll, that is burden sharing agreement with member states?
That's a very interesting question. So what I said, well, basically I don't have a real answer. It's something I think could be part of a discussion in the preparation of a new package, and I would love to discuss with everybody before really making up my own mind. But I deliberately used the wording burden sharing agreement because that's what we have done when we had the 2020 targets. No, so at the 2020 targets discussion, we did agree that all of us should invest in renewables, and then we had a discussion on which country should carry which burden. And then in that case of the renewables, we had a formula that took into account the GDP of a country. So we voluntarily agreed that countries with a bigger GDP should pay more. And we also took into account that some countries in the past had already invested a lot in renewables, so they should not be punished for that. So we should have some correction for that also, historical efforts, and also a correction for potential, of course. So if it is easier in one country to invest in renewables, they can carry more of the burden. So we took all those elements into account. You could imagine to do the same for interconnection. If we are discussing today and we are looking at this map, where is it? The map I showed in the beginning here. You could say, okay, if we go from the left picture to the right, so we have a full list of projects, and then we can discuss who should pay how much of this total cost. And one of the things we could take into account again is how much it is the relative cost of these projects. Maybe in some country it's much more difficult to invest in interconnection than in another. Some countries have done more efforts historically than others. Some countries are richer than others. So that's what you could do. And at the end you would have some agreement, and then that agreement could be implemented, for instance, with the EU tariff component. That's one idea. There are other ideas. So I think we should be inspired by existing experiences we have had in other contexts. Maybe we have interesting experiences in other sectors for other type of infrastructure. So it looks like a very nice research topic for the future for us.
Good. Then let's try to answer to a couple of questions more. So we have this question, very interesting. There are grants from EU to PCIs. This leads to an incentive to overestimate benefits to get the grants. Did we consider this in our solutions, the suggested solutions?
Well, it depends. If there is really incentives to overestimate the benefits. It depends on whether or not these EU grants are a profit for the company trying to get the grant or not. And as far as I'm aware, this is not always the case, or it's not even allowed by EU regulations. So, I'm not sure that this is really the case. There could be other reasons why that promoters might want to overestimate the benefits, simply because they would like to do the investment. But I'm not even sure about that. And that's actually a good introduction to the next topic we will work on, which is incentives. How to give adequate incentives to promoters. And that includes how to give adequate incentives to make a good cost-benefit analysis and to avoid that we make the wrong investments and that we apply for EU grants for projects that are not important. So I would shift it a little bit to the next topic we will discuss, because it's part of a bigger discussion of incentives, I think.
Okay. Then one question more. What is the interaction between the two topics you worked on, CBA, CBCA, and the topic you are currently working on, TSO incentives?
there is a lot of interactions. So I am very happy that we will work on all three topics, because I'm realizing what you expect from a CBA method is very different if you use it only to select projects, or if you also use it to do this kind of innovative cross-border cost allocation agreements. And even you should take into account, when discussing TSO incentives, how they can have incentives to do a good CBA. So it's all interconnected, let's say, and that's why I think this at the end of the cycle, let's say we are in the middle now, no? We did the CBA and we are doing here the CBCA. At the end of the cycle, we can have an overview of how these three topics interact, and yeah, maybe this will lead to additional insights.
Good. Okay, and now I would close with this last question, which in fact probably leaves some open questions again. Which are your suggestions concerning possible inconsistencies between what expected by analysis outcomes from CBA and effectively future behavior of a single planned project?
Okay. Whoa. So I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. I think that what the question is alluding to is that when we do the analysis, we calculate the costs and the benefits of a project, not knowing the future. Then at some point we will know if we were wrong or not. But of course, is that the fault of us today taking the decision? Not necessarily. I mean, we know that we are in front of an investment cycle. So we know that we will do a lot of investment in a context of uncertainty. So we will know we know we will make mistakes. So of course we should think about how to reduce mistakes or how to manage it, because to the extent that the people involved fear that the mistakes will be they will be blamed for it, it could lead to no investment today, and that's also what we do not want. So in fact, it's a very important discussion we should have today, to recognize the risks and to really openly discuss it, and to know what we will do ex post if it turns out we did an investment that was not needed. And how can we today minimize that risk?